The COVID-19 pandemic rendered 2020 a year like no other in recent history. Although 2021 starts hopefully with COVID-19 vaccines already being rolled out in numerous countries, the fight against the pandemic is far from over. Insights into human behavior is key to understanding both the systemic causes of the COVID-19 pandemic and how we can act to mitigate its impacts. Behavioral science can play a critical role in combating the effects of an infectious disease outbreak or health emergency, such as the COVID-19 pandemic itself. This means that insights from behavioral, social, and health sciences are and will continue to be invaluable throughout the course of the pandemic. Our next session, titled Examining COVID-19 from Behavioral Perspectives, will be conducted by Dr. Pradeep Krishnatre, former Director, Research and Strategic Planning, Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health, Center of Communication Programs, New Delhi. Our anchor for the session will be Dr. Ruchi Kher Jaggi. She is the Dean and Faculty of Media and Communication, Director, Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication, Symbiosis International University. A few words about Dr. Ruchi. Dr. Ruchi completed her post-graduation in mass communication from Punjab University, Chandigarh. She qualified the UGC NET in the year 2004 and completed her PhD in 2016 at the Department of Media and Communication Studies, University of Pune. Dr. Ruchi has been teaching undergraduate and postgraduate courses for 14 years now. Her areas of specialization are cultural studies, communication theories, and qualitative research methodology. I welcome you, Ruchi ma'am, and I request you to kindly lead the session.
Thank you, Dr. Kazi, and I really thoroughly enjoyed the previous session and also the very, very refreshing break that Ms. Beulah introduced us to. On behalf of Symbiosis International Deemed University and on behalf of the Symbiosis School of Open and Distance Learning, it is my pleasure to welcome you to SymHealth 2021. And I'm very grateful to Symbiosis for extending this opportunity to me to host a session which is contextualized primarily in behavior, communication, and which has overarching concepts of media and understanding media, in particular in the context of health and currently in the crisis of the pandemic that we find ourselves in. In fact, I'm very happy to announce that we have amongst us one of the leading experts in health communication in India, Dr. Pradeep Krishnatre, who I also look up to as not just a senior academic and researcher, but as a mentor who has shaped our thinking in so many ways in the media and communications domain, especially our sensitivity to understanding health communication. Dr. Krishnatre, as mentioned by Dr. Kazi earlier, has been the former director for the Center for Communication and Change India. He's also been the former director, Research and Strategic Planning, Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health, Center for Communication Programs, New Delhi. He's the honorary president for the Center for Research and Education, which is a knowledge NGO. He's been a former professor at Pondicherry Central University in the School of Media and Communication, and Sir has also been the former Dean of Research at the Mudra Institute of Communication and Advertising, that is MICA, Ahmedabad. With a very prolific background in research, academics, and industry, Dr. Krishnatre has worked extensively in the domain of public health. His research expertise in this space with a methodological orientation, which has been driven by large quantitative and qualitative studies, is demonstrated in the umpteen research projects he has done with UNICEF, WHO, PwC, among other agencies. The research projects have been done in the areas of mHealth, midline assessment to understand the current perception, knowledge, and practices of communities with respect to disaster risk reduction, qualitative programmatic evaluation of measles rubella campaign in the 4 southern states of India, design and implementation of road safety journalism fellowship, development of innovative mobile-based audiovisual tool for demand generation for polio and routine vaccine, communication strategy for promoting breastfeeding, pre-test of pack warnings for cigarettes, BDs, and chewing tobacco, and designing communication strategy for a multimedia campaign to clean the Ganga. And this is just to name a few. Sir was very categorical in telling me to keep his profile reading very short. I've tried to summarize it as much as possible, Dr. Krishnatre, but please allow me to share a few more things. In addition to this, Dr. Krishnatre has also designed several training modules for multiple stakeholders and communities pertaining to different aspects of health communication. He's the author of several books and book chapters. He's also published extensively in national and international journals, and he has been the editor of several reputed journals from my domain. And a couple of them that I would really like to mention are the Sage Journal of Creative Communications and Media Asia, which is now published by Taylor and Francis. It is I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that Sir has recently authored several articles on the COVID-19 pandemic, which have been published in Countercurrents, Vidura, The Wire, The Federal, Health Analytics Asia, among other platforms. It is our privilege to have him as a speaker in SIM Health today. Dr. Pradeep Krishnatre would be speaking on the topic examining COVID-19 from behavioral perspectives. Once again, welcome everyone to the session, and I welcome Dr. Krishnatre. And sir, the stage is all yours. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I've been online for about 15-20 minutes, and it was a pleasure indeed listening to Colonel Goel and Ms. Beulah. And I'll certainly, take care of my eyes because, since last 1 year or so, I have been, watching YouTube and other channels quite extensively, and my eyes have begun to hurt, so I now know what exactly to do. Thank you very much, Dr. Ruchi Jaggi, for introducing me to the online audience. I also thank the Symbiosis International University and especially the Symbiosis School of Open and Distance Learning for inviting me to share my thoughts on the broad domain of health communication. Now, two things before I actually begin. One is that, now that summer is already here, there are frequent power outages, in the area where I live, which is Greater Noida near Delhi. So in case, I suddenly disappear off the screen, please don't think that, I'm certainly frightened and therefore I don't want to be seen on the screen. That's certainly not the case. You may have to wait for some time because the generator would come on and then, you can again see me there. The other thing is, I think I may speak for a little longer. So, whenever you want me to stop, Dr. Ruchi Jaggi, just let me know 5 minutes in advance so I'll stop. Otherwise, I may just go on and on for a while and I can bore your audiences also. Okay, so those of us, who are in the business of persuasive communication or development communication have long realized that the domain of public health communication or health communication management, occupies an important position. At no other time has this realization become more self-evident than it has in the last year or so. My presentation deals with 3 aspects of COVID-19. Okay, to begin with, it focuses on the tensions and contradictions between an emerging COVID-19 science, its vicissitudes, and the confusion that inevitably follows it. And that I think I'm going to speak at length on this particular aspect. So we need to understand, how science actually works and how people like you and me, basically, who are not scientists, interpret it. And that I think is going to be the brunt of my presentation. And then I move on to a relatively recent phenomenon that the world has begun to pay attention to, which is, misinformation. The discussion here focuses on the spate of COVID-19 related information or misinformation that institutions and organizations, national and international, have to deal with. I basically do this, I want to capture and categorize what misconceptions, and misinformation certain sections of society share, about COVID-19 and discuss very, very briefly, why they do so. Finally, the presentation deals with the issue of COVID-19 related stigma. Persons suffering from several health conditions encounter stigma and discrimination, as do persons with COVID-19. This presentation discusses who is stigmatized in COVID-19, and why. Okay, interspersed in the discussion of different themes I have mentioned are references to some concepts of behavioral change. While doing so, I examine the COVID-19 pandemic from the public's perspective. The question I'm seized with is this: why do people behave the way they do when they are told that doing so would encounter risk? There are indeed limitations when we begin to examine a health issue from a patient's or a people's perspective. Okay, but let us not forget that some of our exalted notions of democracy, legitimacy, and accountability, are rest largely on popular mandates. And therefore it is important to understand, how people interpret, COVID-19 or what scientists have to say. I argue that COVID-19 is all about behavior change, but getting the public to change their behaviors has not been easy, as it has never been actually. Okay, so let me begin with the first aspect that I highlighted, which is the tension and contradictions between the practice of science and its layperson understanding of understanding of that eventually and unhelpfully leads to confusion. Despite twists and turns, on COVID-19, the scientific community has well-established ways of classifying diseases. However, over the centuries, people and cultures have evolved their own unique systems of interpreting them. A simple heuristic they follow is whether the disease is curable or not, or whether a person afflicted with the disease can return to leading a normal life. Following this mode of unexceptionable logic, one may classify diseases into 4 categories. The first category is those diseases that once ravaged populations but now have disappeared. Smallpox is a good example of this. Okay, but myths and misconceptions about smallpox continue to persist. The second category of diseases are those that are virulent enough to adversely affect much of the population, but have vaccines or drugs to control them, such as measles or TB. People are reassured that they can lead a disability-free life, and continue to lead, a normal life almost. However, misinformation regarding such diseases continues to grow, and we have seen in recent examples, several countries have had bouts of, measles. And the third category are those diseases where cure is not available, as in the case of diabetes, but people are able to manage them and live a near normal life. Several people do not readily admit that they are diabetic, or for that matter, they suffer from cancer or any other such disease, leprosy, etc., etc. The unwillingness to share information is likely an indication that doing so may invite stigma. COVID-19 falls in the 4th category, about which health experts or epidemiologists at the present juncture cannot say anything substantial about medication with any amount of certainty. Some answers are obvious though. COVID has no guaranteed cure as of now. There are certainly vaccines, but we are not exactly sure how long their effect would last. Meanwhile, the speed of transmission of disease is very high, and people are getting affected in large numbers. Okay. Epidemiologists had inferred that about a year ago that about 2% die of COVID-19. However, people imagine themselves to be part of that small percentage. Politicians and public health specialists, however, speak in different voices. Not long ago, some said healthy people should wear masks. Then others said it is not necessary. A few weeks later, those who had said early on that masks are not necessary began to say, yes, they are necessary. We were first told that the virus spreads through the air via large droplets produced when people cough or sneeze. A few weeks later, 200 scientists said that it could spread even by smaller droplets known as aerosol. Now, a few days ago, the respectable journal The Lancet averred that the virus is airborne. Just about any public health expert or researcher has an opinion or advice, but none has an answer, especially from the people's point of view where they require a very certain answer. Meanwhile, the virus continues to take its toll. Susan Sontag here, who said that illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship, in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the stick. Although we all prefer to not use the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place, unquote. That other place is just about everywhere. Despite 7 days of, quote, complete lockdown, unquote, last year, India saw a disturbing spike in COVID-19 cases. With over 7 million cases then, the Indian government said there was no community transmission. Others contended that if it is not community transmission, what is? Some governments use lockdown to ramp up the health infrastructure. Others used it to contain the spread of the virus. With some, the mantra was test, test, test. Others did not agree. For example, Sweden and some northern countries actually. Some scientists and public health experts called for quote unquote focused protection. Others did not agree. Italy or India, Brazil or Sweden, whatever countries tried, the virus refused to go away. COVID times have also seen a veritable information explosion. This pandemic may perhaps be the first news story to grab international media attention for so long, a story that has constantly amplified itself to stay in the headlines. It may also be the first globally televised public health issue. The virus has brought about a remarkable convergence, of agendas among three important, players: public, government, and media. However, the moot question remains: what effect has media amplification had? Some have argued that its coverage has focused on those 5% who were in intensive care unit or have died, not on those 80% who self-resolved. Messaging were either clear nor consistent. All this has left many ordinary people confused. The experts and epidemiologists' assertion is comforting, but not reassuring. The first few months of COVID-19 showed that an emerging infection disease science follows a long and tortuous path, enabling spread of mischief and misinformation. Karl Popper's dictum that good theories generate risky predictions may well finally come true, but much damage and confusion would have occurred by then. When confusion prevails in an emerging science, uncertainty sets in among people. Let me share two examples to illustrate my point. The first is about the drug hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ. The World Health Organization first included it in its 17-country international solidarity clinical trial. It pulled out the drug after studies showed that it had no impact on COVID-19 patients. However, it resumed its global arm of the trial of HCQ after its Data and Safety Monitoring Committee found that there was no increased risk of death for COVID-19 patients taking the drug. Later, the recovery trial at Oxford University found that HCQ showed no benefit for patients with COVID-19 and that it did not prevent people exposed to the virus from becoming sick. The WHO again pulled out the drug and instructed the trial investigators to interrupt the HCQ arm of trial with quote unquote immediate effect. The reading public noticed the flip-flop and drew its own conclusion. The second example is about vaccine development. The Serum Institute of India's Adar Poonawalla, in an interview in late December or perhaps early January this year, said that only 3 vaccines passed all the scientific evaluations: Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Oxford AstraZeneca. And that while the others were safe, quote unquote, safe like water, quote, their effectiveness had not yet been evaluated. This was a direct reference to Bharat Biotech's Covaxin, which had not cleared the 3rd phase of development, but had been promoted as a safe and efficacious vaccine. Later, AstraZeneca's vaccine came under cloud when several European countries either halted or stopped its use. Was this one competitor bad-mouthing the other? We don't know, but it surely made people, including much of medical fraternity, suspicious about vaccines. As a rigorous science, drug or vaccine development relies on incontrovertible evidence. When evidence itself undergoes frequent and rapid change, as in the case of COVID-19 vaccines, it seeps and spreads into society not as knowledge, but uncertainty, even chaos. But this is how evidence accumulates into science. That's the tragedy. Okay, this is how science actually works. It's not a neat and a clean and straight road. COVID-19 has made science accessible to the public, perhaps as never before. However, the same public may not have learned to interpret it the way scientists want us to. Hippocrates said, quote, "The art of medicine is long and life is short, opportunity fleeting, the experiment perilous, judgment flawed." Unquote. Confusion also gives rise to controversy. The American and Chinese governments were caught in an unseemly spat over the origin of coronavirus. The United States president refused to wear the mask while all the country's experts swore by it. Adding to the controversy were its citizens who clamored for opening of economy with placards saying, quote, freedom over fear, unquote. The Brazilian president refused to accept the gravity of the outbreak, forcing 2 of his ministers of health to resign. The infectious disease experts called for school closures to arrest the spread of virus, but others argued that doing so would affect mental health of children and affect learning. In India, the states followed their own guidelines and did not agree with the federal government. In some cases, the federal government and the courts did not see eye to eye. All this blows up into myriad controversies. As a discipline, behavioral science searches for patterns, consistency, and rationality. In its absence, the explanatory and predictive power of its theories and models wane. As is usually the case in the absence of medicine, behavior science occupies center stage. In the present case, the objective of such non-pharmaceutical behavioral and social interventions is to delay or reduce the size of the peak. Public health and information experts have constantly spoken about on TV and other kinds of other places also, recommend some behavior. They've spoken about, some behaviors for individuals to follow. Hands with soap or using sanitizer, maintaining social distance, wearing mask, staying indoors, so on and so forth. Each of these recommended behaviors is simple to practice. Practicing them all at the same time is a challenge. Equally important, but not so widely emphasized, are behaviors that people should not perform. They should not go to office, they should not go to school, they should not visit restaurants, they should not visit malls, they should not visit pubs, they should not go to beach, etc., etc. The do's and don'ts compel people to switch their normal behaviors to what we can call unsocial at the press of a button, as it were. At one time, the recommended behaviors looked like temporary measures. Over time, however, they seem to have acquired a permanence of their own. No one is quite sure how long these would last. There appears no closure in sight. Given this complexity, compliance has become a challenge. Harvard professor Vishwanath got it right when he said, complexity is the enemy of compliance, unquote. Theoretically, small behavioral adjustments should reduce the impact of COVID-19. Have people made these adjustments? Do people in India and other developing countries have the wherewithal to do so? Let us try understanding this from just one behavior several recognized authorities recommend: 20-second hand wash. On the face of it, the 20-second hand wash appears to be an eminently doable recommendation. The suggestion, however, assumes availability of water for a family of 4 to not only wash hands, but do all the other domestic and personal tasks. Experts inform that a 20-second hand wash uses about 2 liters of water. Assuming that a person washes hands at least 4 times a day, she or he uses 8 liters of water. A family of 4 will require 32 liters just for hand wash. For all the other domestic chores such as bathing, cooking, washing, etc., the quantity required would be many times more. A water-deprived family cannot simply afford to engage in the luxury of washing hands every time for 20 seconds unless 1 or 2 members of the household commit themselves to fetching water. It is probable that such a family may tune out such a hand wash recommendation and may become susceptible to misinformation. At its core, the matter is one of risk perception. If the perceived risk of coronavirus infection is high, fear follows. For example, it could be me, that is fear. People search for ways to reduce risk and fear. If staying at home reduces risk, people prefer to do so. They volunteer to give up their natural social self for a while and trade it for self-imposed isolation. However, if perceived risk of infection is low, then such people flout sane advice. They not only believe they are not susceptible, but if infected, they believe they will recover. The burden of evidence in the public domain supports this perception. After all, 80% of cases self-resolve, experts claim. However, their chance of infection, that is people's chance of infection, increases in proportion to the extent to which they violate the advice. The behavior change experts have an interesting theory about the latter. People often believe that bad things would not happen to them and will more likely affect others. This tendency to underestimate the probability of bad events happening to them is called optimism bias. It will happen to them, not me, is what it actually says. A common example of such bias are young male and female tobacco consumers who do not deny the ill effects of smoking or chewing tobacco, but believe that such harm would not visit them. In the case of COVID-19 too, we see such behavior when young boys and girls defy sane advice and visit parks, roam streets, and celebrate quote-unquote coronavirus parties. On the other hand, there are those who overestimate the probability of bad events happening to them. They buy a protective gear, rush to hospitals, demand remdesivir, and clog the system, thereby denying access to those who deserve to be there. Often it is a toss-up, between threat and fear. When faced with a threat such as COVID-19, some of us either control the threat and some control their fear of the threat. If people control fear, then the strategy should not be to frighten them any further. Instead, it makes sense to increase their perception that they are competent to perform the task needed to control that fear. In other words, the strategy should emphasize that they have the ability to do something positive. However, if people control the threat of COVID-19 or fear, they take protective action to avoid or reduce the threat. In this situation, the strategy should be to inform or demonstrate to them how they can avoid the threat effectively. Another challenge facing behavior change in the context of COVID-19 is misinformation. Several health programs, especially relating to vaccination, always had fair share of it. However, of late, misinformation has acquired epidemic proportion. It now has a new name, infodemic. Some of you may have heard or seen about it. And it has been elevated to the level of science. It's called infodemiology. If epidemics are devastating, infodemic is no less so. Whatever its nature, misinformation is a heady mixture. It has troubled WHO and the UN. Both have had to respond to it. WHO has done its own ways, UN has done its own ways. Both, Secretary General of UN others have done some remarkable work in this year. And therefore the UN, Secretary General Guterres has said something very interesting. Let me quote him. He says, quote, "Misinformation spreads online in messaging apps and person to person. Its creators use savvy production and distribution methods. To counter it, scientists and institutions like the United Nations need to reach people with accurate information they can trust." He then added gravely, "We cannot cede our virtual space to those who traffic in lies, fear, and hate." And I have several examples of, lies, fear, and hate. COVID-19 related stigma stands at the intersection of health science and social science. Its two dimensions, care and cure, straddle both the disciplinary paradigms. The first dimension, care, requires a supportive community on one side and an empathetic health worker on the other to flank the stigmatized. Similarly, the second dimension, cure, requires partnership between the health system and the community on one side and connectedness between the health system and the health worker on the other. Any weakness, in either of the two dimensions can give rise or deepen stigma. Several health conditions are marked with stigma and some of these have no cure. HIV and cancer are two examples that immediately come to mind. It is noteworthy that absence of cure may lead to stigma, but its availability does not automatically mean that stigma would cease to exist. Today, leprosy is treatable yet persons released from treatment continue to be stigmatized. So this bit of a quandary now, okay, between health sciences and social sciences. How do you basically remove stigma? Because some authors have said that, you know, you have to first tackle stigma before you actually bring cure to the patient. So there is some kind of a, you know, paradox there between health science and, you know, the medical science there. The concept of stigma is similar to labeling, stereotyping, or prejudice, yet is different from them all. To be sure, stigma refers to an attribute of property that is deeply discrediting with a particular in a particular social interaction. That is, an attribute acquires a negative meaning in specific social and cultural contexts and not otherwise. Implicit in the notion of social interaction is the concept of the generalized other. Groups that discredit a person or persons because he or she possesses that attribute. Goffman states that stigma does not reside in the attribute. And this is a very important observation that Goffman made about 50, 60 years ago. Okay, and let me repeat that. Goffman states that stigma does not reside in the attribute, but is ascribed by so-called normal others to those who are seen as not fulfilling normative expectations. The undesired differentness may sometimes be so strong as to preclude recognition of any other qualities the person may possess. In effect, the attributes make the person a lesser human being and is treated as such. Now, let me just read out the last paragraph before I close here. In the health context, the undesired differentness a person is perceived as possessing typically relates to attributes of physical disfigurement, blemishes of individual character, you know, for example, HIV/AIDS, or threats to well-being, which is, for example, you know, TB. However, in all these three instances, the health condition impedes social interaction. Leprosy disrupts social interaction because it defies the expectation of looking pleasant or physically attractive. Obesity, squint eye, blindness, dwarfism, psoriasis, chickenpox, Parkinson's fall into the same category. In all these cases, social interaction becomes uncertain, unpredictable, or even awkward for the participants. On the other hand, persons with HIV/AIDS due to multiple partners, for example, commercial sex workers, are held responsible for their behavior and are likely to invite stigma. Okay, so let me stop here because there are several, you know, things that stigma, what happens after stigma visits a person is something that we can do. If there are questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krishnatre, for a very, very nuanced take on putting health in the context of social sciences and helping us unravel it from so many points of view. I think, yes, the time is indeed very short for a subject of this magnitude, and the depth with which you are addressing each aspect, you know, from a general conversation on how media plays a role in terms of amplifying the narrative around a health crisis like the pandemic situation that we find ourselves in, to also analyzing the media's role. And I think that a couple of participants have, like, while you were speaking, a couple of comments that came to me directly were more about asking your take on the entire disinformation, misinformation crisis that because of a lot of social media, this pandemic has created. And you very rightly referred to the term infodemic as you were talking about it. So, sir, I'll just collate all the questions and inputs I received, and I'll request you to reflect on them for 3-4 minutes before we can close. One, of course, is this entire infodemic crisis that because we need the media more than ever. And then with all of this, it seems that do we need the media more than ever? You know, that kind of an irony, that sort of a contradiction. The other thing I really thought, which hasn't been able to be very smartly tackled by any kind of health campaigns, especially during the crisis that we find ourselves in now, or for that matter, of any scary health crisis, is something that you talked about, that is the optimism bias. Even with the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic in India, there are a lot of people who still are in denial, who don't think that this is ever going to hit them. While today, you read sentences and phrases on social media like that the numbers are getting changed to names, names are getting changed to known names. And while we are both discussing this, I just got a message in my extended family, somebody just passed away with COVID-19, and this is the world we have come to inhabit, yet we all live in this very delusional space of the optimism bias. So I know I'm saying a lot of things, sir, but if you could give us some parting reflections on all of this and the role of the media, I think it will be like something to reflect on for all of us here. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Two very important questions from students and even from you. So, as far as infodemic is concerned, this certainly is a major crisis, and much of it actually is coming from social media, okay? And social media is largely, but I wouldn't say mainly responsible, because we are focusing on information, misinformation. I'll just restrict my comments to misinformation only. No, so, misinformation has worked in different ways. There are people, and much of it is coming from outside the country, and it is also because of confusion that some amount of, misinformation is happening. The important thing here, I believe, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, is that in the absence of any relief, the alleged cure addresses so for example, misinformation, I have been also getting, several, actually I've been stacking all the misinformation, all the messages about cure and everything else. I got something very funny yesterday, but, people seem to be believing in this. So the question is, in the absence of any relief and confusion that surrounds relief, okay, the alleged cure addresses the perceived probability of infection and promises efficacy if the person follows the recommended action. This is the beauty about this, okay? It often misinformation often preys on fear and creates Frankenstein out of individuals or institutions. And that, I think, is the greatest harm that it does. It creates Frankenstein out of individuals and institutions. ICMR, Government of India, Health Department, think of an institution. President Truman was doing this, and in India also there are several organizations doing this. So the interesting thing about misinformation is it is devoid of scientific jargon, and the promised relief is accessible to easy interpretation. So it's easy to understand. It does not require cognitive elaboration. If you have to read anything about cure and what vaccines do, how vaccines are developed, it requires, considerable thinking, reading. It requires effort, cognitive effort. In the case of misinformation, that is not at all required. In fact, the quote unquote, the message is often suffused with emotional content. That's another characteristic of, misinformation. It's suffused with emotional content. The simpler its logic, the easier it is to accept it, okay? For example, and I'm going to give you an example now, and this came last year, not in India, but somewhere else. A post asked people to hold their breath without coughing for 10 seconds. If they failed to do so, then it showed that they had coronavirus. Everyone can hold our breath for 10 seconds. It was so easy. You don't have to go to a doctor. You don't have to go undergo tests and other kinds of things also. So the scientists have challenged each of these, unproven assertions, but they have little to offer in terms of relief and cure. So this is a period, a very difficult transition period where the scientists don't have a ready and a convincing answer, and the other side seems to having just about all the answers.
Right.
Basically, what scientists are doing now is they are contradicting, but their contradictions are like fillers in a newspaper page. They fulfill a function. They do not grab attention. This is a paradox. This is a very difficult situation that we are in. And therefore, and my last thing before I talk about, the other question that you've asked, there are, I think, some 3 or 4 characteristics of misinformation. One is, you can't, and I call them all by V's here. One is veracity, which is, you can't trust, you can't check the veracity of the statement. The other is volume. You get so much of it, that you sometimes tend to believe, okay, this person is saying, that person is saying, the other person is saying. That's the other thing that we need to talk about. Okay? And then the third veracity is, of course, the speed with which it travels. The volume is one, and then,
velocity. Yeah.
Velocity, yeah, V is velocity. Yeah, the velocity is the other kind of thing. So 3 V's that I've spoken to, I think velocity, veracity, and volume.
Right.
So I think, this is, and the scientific information, is written in a stilted language, is devoid of any emotion. It is written in third person. We do not immediately can empathize with that information. Whereas in misinformation, we easily and readily and almost instinctively identify ourselves with it. So this is a conflict kind of a situation. I think it has happened every time whenever there's I think, in 1920s, just before 1920s, when Spanish flu occurred, even the same kind of a thing was happened. And stigma, therefore, is an output, is an output of, all this, messy thing that we are going right now. Now, optimism bias has actually been studied to a large extent, which is, what is known as a third person effect, that it cannot happen to me, but it can happen to others. And what it basically means is that, and one of the ways by which you can actually counter this is there are one or two ways by which you can counter it. At least, this is what people have attempted to respond to this in one or two ways. One is, by speaking in the language of the people, your target audience. I remember in Hyderabad, which is the city that I come from, there were, when the police department introduced wearing of helmets, people were not wearing so. So there is a lake called Tangbund in Hyderabad, and right at the end of one side of Tangbund, they put up a poster, and it was a very revealing, very interesting poster. And I still remember this, which is almost 40, 50 years old now. It said, drive like hell, you will surely reach there. It is exactly written the way in which, people who were roughshod, riding motorcycles, would understand that kind of a language. So one thing is, you use the language, their style of speaking, and other things, that people usually, your target audience basically does. The other thing, and this is what, science is very clear about this, you shouldn't be using fear at all, because people just switch themselves off when you speak to them fear. This is a great learning that we got in HIV/AIDS. The other thing basically is to demonstrate that, it is possible, what is known as efficacy, that you need to build people's efficacy. Okay, so that if you can tell them how they can avoid something of like this, then it becomes possible, at least for some of the people, to follow that behaviors. Okay, this is what unfortunately we are trying to do, but in this case is very different, because we are being asked to do several things at the same time, and as I said in my presentation, it becomes very difficult to follow that, because our natural self, I think proximity is something, that we show. For example, when I stand by my wife's side, I'm very, I indicate by my proximity how close she is to me. So proximity of behavior is a very important factor of social life. What COVID-19 basically is telling us, don't follow that. Now, that is a very difficult thing to follow over a period of time. And that's what I think people are doing.
So thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Krishnaathre. Thank you so much for deconstructing the entire information context in which any kind of health messages operate, with so many examples. And I'm very, I think these are very valuable insights. I think for the purpose of just summing it up for all our audiences, they're all health professionals. So I don't think that I can offer you anything which is more conceptual or contextual to the field that you come from. But I think 3 takeaways for all of us, because all of us are mass consumers of information using the social media. I think 3 simple things that Sir talked about is something that we can keep in our mind. If it is too simple to understand and do, that means there's something wrong with it, especially when we are talking about a very scientific context like managing a pandemic. Please remember the 3 V's, veracity. That means if you cannot verify it, it is misinformation. Volume. If you're getting too much of it, that means there is some problem with it. There cannot be too much of information coming from all over. And the velocity and the speed with which, across all your WhatsApp groups, when the same message gets broadcast to everyone in the same 15 minutes, that means there is some agenda behind it. Sir spoke about some countries' examples about holding your breath for 10 seconds. I was a part of a study on children, media, and COVID-19, along with researchers from 30 other countries last year. And you would be surprised to find out that in a few countries, not just in India, there was a massive agenda on the consumption of garlic to keep that away. And children, young children, 4 to 14 years old, who were a part of our sample, were all believing in it. So this is the kind of damage that misinformation can do. And I think we depend on all you great health professionals to help us sort out this infodemic, as Dr. Krishnatre called it. I thank Dr. Krishnatre for these valuable insights, for sparing his time. I think it was an extremely rewarding session, so much to take away in terms of learning and insights. My thanks to Dr. Rajiv Yarwadekar for entrusting me with this responsibility to be a part of this session and discussion. Thank you to the whole SimHealth team for this opportunity, and thank you to all the audiences for being so engaging. Dr. Kazi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchi ma'am. Thank you once again, Krishnatre sir, Ruchi ma'am. We have Dr. Rajiv with us here who would like to say a few words.
Well, first of all, Ruchi, it's always a pleasure and delight to connect with you. As colleague dean, I always learn from you. So the healthcare gyan I give you, but the media and communication gyan, which is more important for us to function efficiently as healthcare professionals, comes from you. So thanks for that. Ever since you first anchored the session on SimHealth way back in 2017. And Pradeep ji, what should I say? The 3 V's and all that, it's fantastic stuff, and I mean, we always realize how lame and how crippled we are in communication strategies, whether it's in individual private practice or whether it's in an institutional practice or even multilateral agencies like the WHO and the UNICEF and all that, devising communication strategies to effectively imprint on the audience, the consumers, the message they would like to, convey. And I always quote this example, it always started with way back in the 70s about tobacco consumption being harmful to health. Then they said that cigarette smoking causes, because it did not have any impact, it went on to say that cigarette smoking causes cancer, which still did not have the desired effect. And finally, they said cigarette smoking causes death. And that had the signature, shock effect. But probably what is favorite to me, and the one which I quoted in my interaction with Amir Khan the other day, when again Ruchi beautifully anchored this session with Amir Khan about, media. And, I told him that media has come a long way. Tare Zameen Par and all that portray very realistically the medical issues which need to come to the ground, or Urta Punjab of substance abuse. Gone are the days when we had triple transfusions going on in Amar Akbar Anthony style. Gone are the days when, the patient used to be shown to be wheeled inside the theater immediately after an accident. And within half an hour, the doctor would come out of the theater, wiping the sweat off his brow and saying, "Operation Kamyab ho gaya." When we know as healthcare professionals, it's such a nightmare to comment anything about the stability of the patient within the first 48 hours after an operation, which is so critical. And never is a patient wheeled in directly into a theater before being stabilized. But probably the most amusing and the humorous one, which I as a gynecologist always share with Ruchi, is this scenario where the girl has a fainting attack, newly married woman, collapses, and the family doctor is summoned, and lo and behold, he feels the pulse and he says, "Mubarak ho, aap baap banne wale ho." And it defies my medical and my OBGYN gynec knowledge as to, yes, there could be Nadi Pariksha as one of the supportive diagnosis of pregnancy, but there are a million other causes. And then I wonder whether I wasted 3 years learning the art and science of obstetrics. But that's the importance of health communication. And I was sharing with my team, let's not reach out to the media professionals only in times of crisis when you've got an untoward event going on in your hospital or in a private practice. Reach out to the media in times when you don't need to them. Pass on the social responsibility. Just yesterday, sir, we released a beautiful article by one of my faculty members who speaks about body donation. Because as healthcare professionals, we are all today what we have dissected out the cadavers, the dead bodies. And today, because of the COVID, we are not getting adequate number of dead bodies from medical colleges. The government medical colleges are a tad better, but the private medical colleges, like when we did medicine, we were 10 of us on one human body. So 5 on one side and 5 on the other. I now have been given to understand that they're forced to have 10, 20 people on one. What will these doctors learn? And the first seed of learning is sown on by way of dissecting these cadavers. So I shudder to think, I mean, God forbid, we hopefully will not land up seeking healthcare from these doctors. There's no offense meant to their training, but it's the system which has got derailed because of lack of awareness about a simple thing like body donation and cadaveric donation. And we are dependent on that as the first stepping stone. So Pradeep, I can't thank you enough. And Ruchi, of course, you for having got this session to the table. And these youngsters who are in mid-course professionals need to carry on this baton of ensuring effective health communication. Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure and a learning experience to interact with you yet again. Thank you, Pradeep.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ruchi.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rajesh, sir. Thank you, sir, ma'am, once again. It was a delight, a rather delight to have you all on board.